In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers, Sublation Magazine readers, sublators, after-party guests, patrons, skeptics, Democrats, Republicans, and everyone else. It's I, Douglas Lane. I'm the head honcho here at Sublation Media, the author of a book called Fall Into Time. That's the one I'll mention today. Need to write more of them. And with me today is Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin, introduce yourself.
Hey, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge. I'm the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so my goal today, and this we may not be able to achieve it, but my goal today is to cover Trump's most recent round of tariff threats, and also the I want to return to something that's been bothering me about the declassification efforts of the JFK files, and look briefly at the recently announced investigation into James Comey and John Brennan, the former heads of the FBI and the CIA are being investigated for their abuse of the intelligence agencies back when Trump was first elected president in 2016 and 2017. So those are the topics we want to cover, but let's start with the tariffs. So is this something other than a kind of negotiating tactic from Trump, trying to apply pressure across the board to various state actors as he negotiates new trade deals, or does he actually want to institute and apply these tariffs in at least some of the cases that he's threatening right now?
Well, for it to be in any way, shape, or form a negotiating tactic, there would have to be some credible threat of application. Part of the trouble is that at this point, he's doing a Xi Jinping impression. He's got negotiating teams that are negotiating deals. The trade partners think that they have received concessions or agreements on various elements of a deal, that they're getting close to or approaching a deal. And then it's revealed that the negotiating team is not backed by the president. And this is the same problem that the Americans were having with the Chinese during the negotiations in the first Trump administration. There would be agreements. The Chinese diplomats would seem to make good faith concessions, and then they would take the deal back to Beijing, and Beijing would change the wording, unilaterally reject various elements that had been agreed upon in the prior negotiations, and then try to move forward, having completely reconfigured the deal. So now he looks like he's leading China rather than the United States from the point of view of the allied countries. He's engaging in negotiating tactics that they associate with China. And this is causing them to go, okay, is it even possible to negotiate a good faith deal with this administration? So now we're starting to get the talk about the EU doing some kind of deal with the CPTPP, which is the version of the TPP that went into force after Trump withdrew from the TPP. And for people who may not remember, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big free trade deal that was to include Japan and Malaysia and Chile and a number of countries around the Pacific Rim. Mm-hmm. This deal, which Obama was negotiating, was going to include the United States, and the kind of function of the deal was to be a big trade deal that would exclude China, but include the United States. And it offered carrots to Pacific countries to go into it. They would get favorable access to the US market. It was a deal that was done kind of on old neoliberal lines. So it was a deal that would give big access to allied states, to the US market, to bind them into what would be a security arrangement ultimately, not just a trade bloc. This is about the pivot to Asia. It's about creating a ring of allied states with close, not just security ties to the United States, but also economic ties. Trump thought that trade deal was too disadvantageous to Americans, to American industry, and he pulled out of it. But the remaining states went ahead and made a version of it anyway without him, and they removed a lot of the elements of the deal that had previously been incorporated in it just to benefit the United States or please the United States. So the version of the CPTPP that now exists is less favorable to the American position than the version that was originally on the table before Trump became president. And the UK has gone into it. The UK entered into the CPTPP, and now the UK is talking with Germany about some kind of EU CPTPP cooperation, with the aim being to maybe reform the WTO. So the WTO has been all locked up ever since in the late 10s, the Trump administration began refusing to confirm appointments to its appellate body. So it's been unable to use its dispute resolution mechanism to resolve trade disputes. And that has really hampered the functioning of the WTO. The EU and the other allied states don't like this strategy of trying to procedurally lock up the WTO to extract reforms. Many of these states think that the WTO should be reformed in various ways, to some degree in line with some of the US proposals, but they want the reforms to be multilateral and rules-based rather than through this kind of game. So many of these states are potentially interested in some kind of large allies pact that would include something like 30% of world GDP, a set of states that includes producer states like Germany and Japan, but also a lot of states with reasonably high final consumption per capita, over 20K, not the 40K plus that the United States has, but still considerable. But it's a lot of states. It's difficult to coordinate. The currency would potentially be the euro, depending on how far you take this. And of course, these states still have security deals with the United States, and they still trade a lot with China. So to try to put together a trade bloc of smaller countries, mid-sized countries, without the rule breakers, the United States or China, and then try to, from that negotiating position, bring the United States potentially back into the rules-based order at some later point, that seems to be something that the allies are now seriously entertaining.
When did Trump leave the TPP deal that Obama had brokered?
Immediately, back in the first administration. It was one of the first things he did.
Why didn't Biden reverse that decision, or did he attempt to?
Biden did not reverse that decision. Biden also did not reverse the decision to stuff up the WTO. Biden continued to refuse to confirm appointments to the WTO. Because of that, it's not obvious that a new Democratic administration would necessarily return to the kind of multilateral strategy that these guys are looking for in Europe.
So this seems to me, just based on that alone, not to really be a uniquely Trumpian move, but there's a bipartisan approach here to try to pressure our allies into, and the WTO into a trade deal that would be more advantageous to the United States than what Obama had managed to put together. Is that right?
Yes, that would be right. The United States in general has become more skeptical of these kinds of trade deals. So there needs to be some effort on the part of the allies to demonstrate that this kind of multilateral strategy is still effective and could potentially be attractive to the United States. I think ultimately the kind of, if this were to be successful, if they were to actually get the CPTPP and the EU together in a serious way, the ultimate goal of this would not be to make a trade bloc that would exclude the United States, but it would be to make a trade bloc that would be attractive enough to the United States that there could then be negotiation with the whole bloc and the United States about a recombination.
Right. So when when you say that the United States is acting like China, it does seem to me that, I mean, in another context, when it comes to foreign policy and other kinds of negotiations, not around trade, that the United States has a reputation for being fickle, and for those who are put in a position of negotiating with our partners or with potential allies, not being given full authority to actually negotiate and being undermined later on. The example that comes to mind for me is an old one. It's very old. It's 1991. The negotiations with Saddam Hussein around Kuwait that then led to Desert Storm. I forget the woman's name who was negotiating with Hussein, but she seemed to give him a green light to invade Kuwait, saying that the United States wasn't interested in border disputes between Arab nations. But in fact, the U.S. did find the invasion of Kuwait to be worthy of a military response. So it seems to me that the United States and maybe other nations, European nations, Asian states, what have you, often have this problem of fully authorizing their negotiators to really set up terms. And especially in a republic where not only the president, but also the Congress has to often sign off on these kinds of deals.
They're accustomed to that. They're accustomed to, they negotiate a trade deal and then the Senate would have to confirm it. They're used to that. And they're also used to a new president gets elected and maybe the new president isn't committed to the negotiations of the previous administration. Lots of trade deals over the years have been tied up in something like that kind of dynamic. What they're not accustomed to is the president's own negotiators telling them that the administration has a position. They negotiate on the basis of that position. And then it's revealed that the president doesn't agree with the position that his own negotiators have taken up in the negotiations.
Now, the problem now is that there's so many
weird.
different negotiations going on that I can't make heads or tails out of like what the terms are and what I haven't really seen a clear explanation of what Trump is objecting to. But in the case of China, what did the trade negotiators think that they were authorized to accept, and what did Trump back out on?
Well, in the case of China, it wasn't that Trump backed out. It was that Xi Jinping changed unilaterally. There's a book by Robert Lighthizer that the Sublation Reading Group read that details to some degree this process and how.
No, I was thinking recently that this was the case because the threats were coming from Trump, not just in terms of Europe, but also it seemed to be aimed at China as well, and maybe like back to the drawing board for all of our allies. It seemed to me, because there was a pause on the tariffs for 90 days until August, and that he was reminding everyone that they hadn't reached the full trade, the kinds of trade agreements he was seeking, and that he would follow up on his threat to reinstitute the tariffs, and that it was across the board, all these wild tariffs. That's how I understood the story.
Well, many of the different individual negotiations were at different stages or different points. So many of the particular states felt, and had good reason to think, because they were receiving communication from our diplomatic teams, that they were progressing toward an agreement. And then all of a sudden, stuff that our diplomats had said to them was rowed back on by the administration that those diplomats are meant to speak for. That's the sense in which I said that he's acting like Xi Jinping. It's not that he is struggling to get trade deals through the rules of the American Republican system. Trade partners understand that our rules are complicated, and sometimes because of elections or because of a mismatch between the administration and the Senate, a trade deal that is negotiated won't ultimately go through. What they do not expect is for the diplomats to not actually be able to represent the position of the president, because the president changes his position frequently or doesn't follow closely all of the different negotiations that are taking place, because how could he? He started too many at once. How can he possibly follow all of them at once? And therefore will intervene in the negotiations without full knowledge of what has really taken place.
So what do you think? So do you think that the truth is Trump doesn't know what he's saying no to at this point, and
Well,
that
how
he's just
could any person actually track all of these negotiations individually? At a certain point, you would have to have a kind of framework for this, and you'd have to trust your diplomatic team to be able to represent your position in relation to the framework in all of these different cases. So either the diplomatic teams are not following the framework isn't clear, or the president is being inconsistent in what he's interpreting the framework to mean. But in any case, it's producing an environment where people don't feel like they can trust the diplomatic team of the United States, which is not usual for trade deals with friendly states.
So Trump has not said in any particular, like he hasn't given any particular examples of the ways in which the negotiations have failed to meet his expectations, and that this is just a statement to remind everyone that he will reinstate the tariffs in August unless some nebulous goal is reached. Is that right?
Yeah, at least in terms of the reporting, we don't seem to have very specific country by country, what are the expectations? We're getting kind of big declarations that these countries will be subject to these tariffs on these dates. And the various countries are going, hey, wait, we thought we were getting somewhere here. We thought we were negotiating a different tariff rate for that date. You know, in some cases, they thought they were getting 10%. They had assurances from the diplomatic team that the concessions they were making would get them a rate of 10%. And all of a sudden, they're included in announcements that say 30% or 35%.
I mean, I don't know how all this works on a daily basis, or what the structure is to inform the president about the negotiations and how they're proceeding, but I would imagine that it would be possible to write a 2 to 3 page summary if you organized all the negotiators in such a way that they had a fairly robust report system of reporting where they were, and a team of people who would analyze those reports and then present them to the president.
Trade deals are really complicated. There's a lot to keep track of in a trade deal, which is why typically if somebody's job is to negotiate a trade deal, they work just on that deal and not on any other deals while they're working on that deal. You can give somebody some facsimile of the information. I'm sure that they do give him some kind of summary of it. But it's not like he's going to be able to be really present in each of these individual negotiations. It's one of the costs of doing so many bilateral negotiations at one time that you just cannot be fully present. It's like trying to play 60 games of chess at once, but the games are much more complicated than chess. It's very hard to do, especially with your full level of attention. It's a full-time job for each of the people leading the negotiation teams, each one of these.
Right. I mean, but if you're Trump and you have a couple of, basic targets that you want to hit, especially with the bigger trade partners like the EU and China, and let's say Canada, Mexico, I'm just spitballing here. You knew what your aims were there. You could get a report telling you how close you were to reaching your target, right? In which case you then might make this big gesture aimed at everyone to remind all of your partners, and especially the big targets, that you carry a big stick and that you're not kidding around.
So on the one hand, you act like you're negotiating with everyone all at once. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of bilateral agreements that you're trying to work on. And each of those individual states thinks that they might get a sweetheart deal with you if they are, and the whole strategy is based on the idea that the countries that are the most pliable will be treated differently, that they'll get sweetheart deals, and that therefore there's a time incentive to make a quick sweetheart deal before other people do, and get the good terms that might be on the table most immediately. That was the logic of it originally, and to use a competitive mechanism of there's a limited amount of time, everybody's negotiating at the same time, and you want to be first, right? But if you treat all of the countries the same, regardless of what efforts they've been making in the bilateral negotiations, it very much undermines that strategy.
Right. I mean, what you'd have to do is have one of your you'd have to have your and they may not be trusted. They probably wouldn't be trusted, but you'd have to have your negotiators say something along the lines of, yes, he is making these big gestures, but we have worked out these terms. He's really aiming this at China and the EU, not at you. You've gotten in early, and the president does really appreciate the way you've been willing to make some concessions, and you need not worry. And you pat them on their hand, and then you just cross your fingers and hope that they're not panicking and full of anxiety, I suppose.
Yeah, what we seem to be hearing is that the negotiating partners are feeling very caught off guard and upset. Particularly, Canada tried very, very hard to cut a deal, and Canada was thrown into the category of 30% plus again. So some of these states really were working at it.
What kind of concessions did Canada make, and what did Trump want from Canada at the start?
Well, in terms of specific concessions, I wouldn't go into a great level of detail about numbers in particular sectors. That would be beyond my scope for individual countries. But the impression that I have from the reporting is that Canada was making good faith concessions in line with what they were having demanded from them by the U.S. trade envoys. They were told that the concessions that they were making would get them a lower tariff rate. They were under this impression. And Canada is in a situation where it doesn't really have a choice but to negotiate because of how much it heavily relies on trade with the United States. So Carney, was getting framed in the Canadian media as the Trump whisperer. He's able to make a deal that because he understands trade, this is the reason to vote for somebody like Carney, because he gets trade. He'll be able to work this out. Their impression was that he was actually getting somewhere, and they seem very caught off guard individually as a specific country by that change in the policy, which explicitly incorporated them in the higher tariff group, despite the negotiations that had been taking place. So it's not just the case that some of the countries that have been included, I think, are being reassured behind scenes that their inclusion isn't real. I think that what is actually happening is that these countries are genuinely panicking because they are not being appropriately reassured, or insofar as they're being reassured, they have no confidence in the people doing the reassuring.
Right. Well, here's how this was my initial impression on this story. I recall the very early days of the tariffs being informed by those who were in the know that Trump's tariffs were insane, that he didn't understand what he was doing, that he was going to wreck the stock market and wreck the economy and hurt working class people, and so on and so forth. What I've seen since then is he's backed off on the tariffs, created conditions for trade to continue somewhat apace in a normal manner, and that the economy is mostly rebounded and the unemployment rate was lower than expected. And I just assumed that the bluster from Trump on this was maybe ill-advised, maybe amateur hour kind of tactics, but nonetheless aimed at creating leverage to shore up deals that he would eventually accept, even not at the level that he originally was espousing he needed. So my guess was just what we're going to see is in about 2 weeks' time, this will become a non-story. The tariffs won't be fully re-implemented, and some sort of negotiated deals will be accepted, and Trump will say, look, all my threats and bluster worked, and spin it as a great triumph, even if it isn't anywhere close to what he originally said he wanted to achieve.
Yeah, it seems that what you're actually able to get from these bilateral negotiations is pretty limited.
Yeah.
But the trade envoys of the United States seemed to be prepared to negotiate along something like these lines.
Mm-hmm.
So to now revert to the more hardline position creates a lot of confusion about what is the United States actually trying to get out of these talks, because the trade envoys have been armed with advice about how to negotiate that they're not sticking to for any great length of time.
Earlier in the conversation, we talked about how this is really not a Trump-centric problem or a position, that both the Biden administration and Trump's administration are attempting to break free of old models for these trade deals.
There's a shared commitment to WTO reform. The question is, how do you go about doing that? And even the allied states, many of them want WTO reform. But how do you go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. But the what I would say is we have to hold in mind is that the U.S. interests and the European interests are not aligned, and that there is that we're going to have trouble finding common ground in terms of WTO reform going forward. And the old terms were not acceptable to the U.S. and more acceptable to Europe. That's what you seem to say at the start.
Europeans want it to be done very differently. The Europeans, I think, also do recognize that there are issues with opening their markets up to China. They have trust issues with trade negotiations with China. They recognize that Xi Jinping plays certain games in trade negotiations that are not favorable to them. Many European states have large production sectors. They do not want these undermined by China. They don't want to end up in a situation similar to the American situation of being overly consumer-oriented and insufficiently capable of pulling weight in the production side. States like Germany, for instance, have plenty of reason to worry about how China trades with Europe. The issue is the Europeans, because they are moderately sized countries, do not see any advantage in getting rid of the rules and returning to a kind of power politics approach. They want a rules-based solution. So they're much more committed to doing it through institutional reform. Whereas the United States wants to play hardball, lock up the institutions, and then try to make other countries agree to reforms.
Right. Well, what do you anticipate is going to be the result of all this, Ben? I mean, do you feel like this is going to fall apart and become a disaster due to Trump's erratic behavior?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's going to fall apart and become a disaster. I don't think that Trump is going to be able to get the deals that he's looking for from this strategy. I think the deals that he can get will not be that different from those that have been negotiated to this point, which have been pretty minor and limited in scope.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the ceiling for this kind of strategy. And in the meantime, the harder he tries to extract more meaningful deals, the more it encourages these states to see if they can find ways to cooperate that get around the United States. And that's not something they can do immediately or easily, but it's something that they could look to do over a 5 to 10 year period if there's no change in the American posture.
Mm-hmm. I've read recently that the onshoring effort is slow going, but is happening. Like something like 80% of American companies are putting the aim of onshoring their manufacturing, in their agendas and coming up with plans to do so, and that like of those 2% have actually completed the process of onshoring their manufacturing effort, which is very small, but
particularly those firms that are related to defense. There's going to be a certain amount of that in the areas related to defense. But of course, if there's uncertainty about the tariffs. So a lot of companies are game planning for if there are substantial tariffs, and that does actually happen. What would that mean? What would they do? But I don't see this kind of strategy producing very large scale reshoring, because even with sizable tariffs, ultimately there are major wage advantages to be found in some of these countries, and the United States can't tariff all of them at such a rate that all of these jobs would have to, all of this industry would have to come back to the United States. That would be too disruptive. You can't tariff everybody all at once and have a functional economy. You have to pick your battles. So you've got to pick some winners here if you want to pick some losers.
Right.
And if you're not able to pick any winners, you're not going to be able to pick any losers.
I mean, there's a kind of fundamental contradiction in Trump's approach, which is, on the one hand, he wants these trade deals to go through, and he wants the trade deals to go through in such a manner that the U.S. economy is not fundamentally damaged or disrupted. Right. He wants to have short-term stability, but on the other hand,
he wants to win the midterms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how important that is to him, but let's assume he does. And more importantly, he doesn't want people to be able to say, let's just assume he's a narcissist, like everyone says. He doesn't want people to be able to say, oh, look, Trump screwed over the economy. He's an idiot, right? He wants to be able to say, look at the stock market. Look at the unemployment rate. I'm a huge success. I'm the biggest success in the history of America, something like that. So he wants that. But at the same time, he believes that the tariffs will not only put pressure on our allies and trade partners to give us better deals, but also incentivize industry to onshore. And so he wants to continue to incentivize that onshoring effort. So he is kind of stuck in a difficult position where the short-term necessities are undermining his long-term aims.
On the original vision for it, if you cut some trade deals very quickly that were very advantageous for certain partner countries, you picked some friends, picked some new friends, real new friends, then that would give you a position of strength. You could friend-shore with the new friends, and you could reshore the stuff that the friends are not right for. You could do that if you had some real serious big deals with significant friends. The issue is that they did not and are not getting those deals. The deals that they're getting are much more minor than that. They are not the kinds of deals which would really facilitate a rapid shift.
So, like, who would be one of these big friends who deserve a big deal?
Well,
Vietnam?
For instance, Indonesia. Indonesia is a country you'd really want to get a deal with. But Indonesia's attitude is that it doesn't want to simply buddy up with either the United States or China. It wants to play it down the middle, and it's interested really in getting into CPTPP. It's petitioned to go into CPTPP in 2024. It formally applied to join. That's what it wants. It wants to be part of a new rules-based system. A country like Indonesia is of vital importance to this kind of strategy, because you've got to have some countries that are able to produce cheap so that you don't have really large-scale disruption. If you want to get out of China, you need some other countries that have relatively cheap, affordable labor in your agreement. Maybe not for every sector, maybe not for every part of the economy, but you've got to at least be able to keep some of these sectors affordable. So you've got to have some developing countries in your bloc. But who are you going with? India hasn't proven that it's able to really manufacture the kinds of stuff on the scale necessary to be an alternative to China. Vietnam has become a bit of a front for China. China moves things through Vietnam and uses Vietnam to get access to the American market. So who's coming into this? Well, the states that were previously considered to be the most prospective friends were included in the TPP, and those states are in CPTPP right now, or they're petitioning to join CPTPP right now. And now the Europeans are flirting with that bloc and trying to give that bloc an alternative to cutting sweetheart deals with the United States individually as individual states.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah, this is another impediment. But what do you think the split is within the Trump administration? I mean, it seems to me that there are factions within the Trump administration that are satisfied with the idea that a good portion of production will be shifted to some of our friends, and that the onshoring efforts will be considerably slower than what was promised. And then there are others who are more nationalists. I would say Vance might be representative of their interests, but I'm not sure, that are uh, possibly pushing Trump to be harsher, even to our hopefully newfound friends in terms of onshoring.
Yeah, there are some people in the administration who want to really use this trade war to decouple from China. They're China hawks, they're anti-China. There are other people in the administration who are looking for some kind of grand bargain with China.
Mm-hmm.
And I would position Trump in this camp. Trump would like to ultimately make some kind of deal with China. And many of the negotiations with the other states, in some way, shape, or form, function as leverage plays in relation to negotiating with China.
Mm-hmm.
Since the possibility of deals with these other states that would alienate or exclude China potentially might be used to compel China to negotiate in some other way with the administration. And TPP could also be viewed, during the Obama years as itself a mechanism for this. The exclusion of China from TPP could be used to extract leverage in further future negotiations with China.
Mm-hmm.
In a similar kind of way, all of these bilateral deals can be used to try to get the Chinese to negotiate differently. But for the bilateral deals to work, you have to actually cut really good deals of the kind that China would envy, of the kind that would make China upset that it was not getting. And we're not really seeing that. Now, at the same time, they have not allowed China into the CPTPP. The Europeans are not really looking to the Chinese. They're looking to the other allied states that are not in Europe. So it's not as if China is getting the benefit of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, these other states are going, we are caught between two states that use bullying tactics with us.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Right.
there some way that we can do without both of them, or limit the degree to which we rely on both of them?
From my perspective as a, everyday guy, socialist leaning, definitely just fully committed socialist, I find all of this to be kind of off-putting because it's so opaque due to the way that it's reported, that everything gets filtered through this extremely partisan apparatus in the media. So you're given like spin from Trump people about how brilliant he is and how stupid the Democratic Party is, and the New York the failing New York Times, and then from the New York Times you just get these stories about the insanity of King Trump, and we're not given the kind of story that you're telling right now. If you could imagine an American public, working class included, that could have a full understanding, or as much of an understanding as you just laid out and as you have, what would you advise people to want? What's in the interest of the American working class?
Well, the trouble is that there is, of course, an interest in maintaining some level of world trade. Rapid, disruption, attempt to go back to autarky and nations fighting each other, competing not just commercially but eventually militarily, would not be in anybody's long-term interest. At the same time, the question is, can you get some kind of multilateral arrangement that is actually credible, that does actually take into account the interests of American workers in a real and serious way, along with German workers, Japanese workers, workers in other rich states. part of the trouble is that for a long time now, there have been many efforts at WTO reform to better defend the interests of the workers in the rich states so that they don't pay the cost of an equalizing process between the core rich states and the developing countries. For the last 50 years, the gap between the rich states and the poor states has gotten a bit smaller at the cost of increased stratification within the rich states and more social tension within the rich states. The trouble is, there has been no ability to come together to make any sort of multilateral agreement that would reduce or limit that tension. And as that tension increases, it produces demands for unilateral action because people lose confidence in the global institutions, they lose confidence in the international system. And because there's no socialist movement, there's no workers' movement, there's nothing else internationalist for them to do, they regress into some kind of flag waving thing. And so I would say there are all sorts of opportunities right now to become a flag waver, but flag waving is not ultimately going to help. Flag waving, if it succeeds, will just result in the dissolution of the whole global trade system and the plunging of the countries back into the possibility of war. So what is needed is some kind of agreement. The difficulty is that we have not been able to get that kind of agreement purely on the basis of the elites of the different states meeting in big fancy cities like Geneva and having their yaps. Without workers playing in some way, these negotiations never adequately take into account the need to deal with the serious social tension that exists inside the particular rich states.
Well, this is where, Ben, you judge me on this. Give me on a scale of like 1 to 10. How good is this transition? You let me know after I try it. So it seems to me that one major problem for working class people in the United States and perhaps across the world is that their understanding of society and their understanding of their own position can never be brought to bear on politics. The fact is that most workers do understand, I think, fundamentally the need to work together as a bloc to get their interests met, and don't view other workers in other nations as enemies. But they have no organizational mechanism in order to come together and put forward an alternative politics. And their understanding is never fully realized within the culture. That you can have a broad understanding of an event and a majority understanding of an event, and it will have no effect either on the politics that come out of the moment, nor on the accepted understanding of the culture as defined by, let's say, the culture industry or the mainstream media or received an acceptable opinion. And so this is my transition to talk about what the JFK files declassification, because it's come to my attention as I've looked into this over the past month or so that the reality is that the American public has largely known the truth about the JFK assassination since around 1967. Most of the information we needed was made public in a variety of ways around 1967. The disputes that remain are manufactured, and they aren't working. Since around 67, it's been around 70%, 65 to 70% of the public believes that Kennedy was assassinated by some state conspiracy. Since 78, the state itself has said that there was a conspiracy and multiple shooters, and yet this has not led to any significant reform or even elite acceptance of the so-called conspiracy theory. And I wanted to point out that the latest round of declassification is a case in point. I'm going to show a clip if I can here. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. So this is from the hearing on the JFK files being declassified. A doctor who was at the Parkland Hospital when Kennedy arrived, so many years ago, testified. Here it is.
Can you tell us about the wounds that you observed on the president and how they differ from what came out in some of the reporting?
The wounds on the president were to his throat and to his head and to his back. The wound to his throat would have killed him. The wound to his head definitely would have killed him. The wound to his back would not have killed him.
Did the wounds to his throat and his head look like completely separate wounds?
They were two separate wounds. The one, well, let me show it to you. The blue wound was sent from the railroad trestle all the way over to kill him right here, and that went to his throat. And the way that killed him is that it obstructed the trachea, and he couldn't breathe. So he would have been dead before he reached the hospital just simply because of that wound. The other wound that he had to his head would have killed him instantly because it removed about a third of his brain.
Thank you. Mr. Hardway, I want to move to you next. You talked about the obstruction of.
All right. So, okay. So that right there should put to rest the Oswald story, but there's so much more evidence than that, and it's all been known since '67. Someone says in the comments here they're going to give us JFK instead of the Epstein one. I don't know about what's going to come out about Epstein. That one isn't one I've looked into too much. But I do think that it's worth examining just the JFK assassination as an example of how history and public understanding is managed. Frederick Jameson talked about how the postmodern condition creates an epistemic difficulties and creates these opaque historical events and crisis points. And I would challenge that and say that they're actually not opaque, that it is not difficult to discover the truth, but that what makes it seem difficult is the lack of power amongst the working class and regular people to define the cultural understanding. What do you make of all that, Ben?
Well, it seems to me that whether it's the case that there is no shared understanding, or it's the case that the shared understanding cannot be concretized and acted upon, that's a difference, and I think an important theoretical difference, but the political implications of the difference are not very great, at least immediately for this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If the issue is that we can't get people to agree on what happened, versus if the issue is that we can't get people to agree on what to say or do with an understanding of what happened, in both cases, we have an agreement problem.
Right. So I think it's worth pausing there and asking, what would we have expected, say, in 1967 or after the House Select Committee's report in '78 to be the result of the understanding that there was a state-run, intelligence community-run assassination on a president? What would have been required if that had been publicly understood and actionable?
Well, I think in your view, what would have occurred would have been some sort of purge of the intelligence services implicated.
Mm-hmm.
or a liquidation of those organizations, or something along those lines. But I don't think that a lot of people who would share your view of what happened also would take the position that the intelligence agencies involved should be liquidated or purged.
Well, I think that what might have happened would be that the full that the truth would have been able to be expressed in a way that political movement could use to achieve political power, to act on the state, right? And
so the non-liquidation could have been an advantage for a political movement calling for liquidation?
Maybe, but it's more that it would have had to have been actually probably an issue in some campaigns. Would have to have been publicly debated and understood within amongst the voters, just strictly speaking on the level of like bourgeois politics. I'm not saying that this would have resolved the problem. I'm saying what would we have expected within the terms of existing society if it was operating as it should. So we would have expected that the basic facts would become publicly known, and then they would be debated, and people would vote based on their understanding and their desire for change. And I think that you would find that even the working class would be rather conservative in terms of how much change and how much reform they really wanted to see in the face of even these revelations. So, but I do think that you would have expected to see those who were directly implicated in the crime to suffer some sort of legal repercussions, or at least being dismissed, and maybe some of them would receive pardons, but nonetheless you would have seen the individuals suffer consequences, and then there would have been a debate about how much institutional reform was necessary in order to make sure this didn't happen again. And none of that happened. So the question becomes why? Because in reality, I think this is the kind of thing that, in theory, a bourgeois state should be able to handle and move beyond, and just using the technical, just using the legal mechanisms and the institutions that exist, without getting to the underlying problem of capitalist reproduction and alienation and corruption and the rackets and all that. So to me, it seems that what we should examine here is the failure of the state to operate on its own basis, and what is making it necessary for this kind of suppression of understanding and suppression of politics. What is making that necessary?
The failure of the state to operate on its own basis. Typically, if I see the state not operating on what I took to be its basis, I go, maybe I'm wrong in my interpretation of its basis. Because if the state can operate on a basis that seems to be different from the one I took it to have, then probably I have just misunderstood it, rather than that it's not operating on its basis.
Well, fair enough. But I mean, there's the myth. I mean, look, the whole reason the Kennedy assassination matters, and the reason that it has been suppressed the way that it has, is because the basis of it is that it's supposed to be a representative republic, answerable to the people, and be set up through a legal system and checks and balances to head off factional interests dominating the population and the state. So that has failed, in a variety of ways. That keeps failing. But the question becomes, for me, why is it necessary for it to fail in such a way that it has to go to war on the public, and on the institutions that lend the state its legitimacy in order to continue? I mean, so obviously the basis, I think the basis would be, roughly speaking, the contradictory process of industrial capitalist production more than these legal structures, and that's what's causing the difficulty. But nonetheless, we shouldn't we shouldn't just say that and be satisfied. We should look a little more closely as to at the way the failure was acted out historically within the state, and what allowed that to happen and why that became necessary. Does that make sense?
I suppose part of the trouble is that there would actually have to be a willingness on the part of the public to fight the state, for the state to have to go to war with the public. And this issue seems to me to be obviously not the kind of issue that could inspire the public to go to war with its state.
But okay, so that's wrong. And here's why it's wrong. And it depends on what you mean by war. But in fact, the public has been the driving force behind revealing the truth about the Kennedy assassination. 67% of the public, roughly, in it was 66% and 67, I think, and it's gone up to 80% after the House Select Committee's report, and then back down again. But the public has largely understood this, and citizen journalists and actual journalists whose job is to keep the state in check have been behind revealing the truth about this assassination, and they have.
So what do you
some
mean
of
by
them,
war then? Because
it's
not like a
the war has been kind
of coup or a.
Well, I mean, the war. Some of those journalists were killed by state actors. Some of them were discredited through character assassination. Some of them were driven into poverty. There are many
cases where we know that the intelligence services have killed American citizens. We know this, right. Public record. These are facts.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we can be fairly confident in a few cases that people who are investigating the Kennedy assassination were killed by the state. There are lists of like 80. 2 or 3 of those are pretty solid cases. But the point is that the state has gone to war against the public in terms of just allowing for the public to make sense of politics and its own position, and particularly around this
going
issue.
To war. That language is a little inflationary. The state has attacked particular people, or agents of the state have. We don't know to what degree, at what level of officially versus unofficially, and with what level of institutional support. Are we talking about factions of the state taking initiative? How coordinated is the state action in these cases? Is it coming from the president? Is it coming from the director of particular intelligence apparatuses? Are agents further down the chain making ad hoc decisions?
Well, the reason I say he's gone to war is because I'm thinking about this all in the context of Walter Benjamin's on the concept of history, and thinking about it in terms of there's like Guy Debord's notion of the spectacle. And so I conceive of the ways in which the truth about this particular event has been managed as being aligned with the way that history overall has been managed and distorted and forgotten. And so, I'm then taking the jump from the theoretical realm that Benjamin outlined in his essay to real politics and real acts of violence, and saying, okay, these things are not cases of bad apples operating independently, but this is a part of a system of the suppression of the public's understanding and the public's ability to organize politically. And that the way to understand on the concept of history is not merely abstractly, but through real life events and the deaths of actual people.
Okay, so you're not talking about a legitimacy crisis which involves the state fighting people in the streets at scale, huge general strike that troops called out.
No,
like a
I'm
fight
talking about the
of that kind.
continual suppression of the public within a representative republic. The way in which a long-term, like maybe Cold War level fight against the public has been maintained, and then
I think
theorized
there's
about.
widespread knowledge that happened in the Cold War. And I think a lot of people know that the war on terror institutions that were cooked up after 9/11 further expanded the power of the intelligence services in various ways. I think people are aware of that, but it doesn't produce fighting back.
Right, and now so the question is why, and right, and I think, well, I suspect that the one place to look is actually not at the state nor at the working class particularly, but at people like Frederick Jameson. The way in which those who would put themselves in the position of helping the working class to organize have allowed themselves to be led astray and have led themselves astray in the way that they approach the problem. Like for Jameson, this became an epistemic cultural problem within the working class, rather than a problem of political organizing. And so it became he made it more difficult and mystified the difficulty, particularly around Kennedy, as neoliberalism took hold. Like neoliberalism took hold not only in the state, but also within the left.
Well, I think people are impelled to describe it this way, in part because there are features of it that lend itself to this kind of description. It's not simply that people come in and mystify. It's not as if in the Cold War there were real movements that were doing anything meaningful, that were disrupted by mystification from people like Jameson. Rather, there were frustrated, failed efforts to do various things, and then people trying to figure out why it seemed that they couldn't do anything, and making theories to try to account for their seeming incapacities.
Jameson created a way to understand the Kennedy assassination that skirted what was actually already known and obscured for the elite set of would-be socialists the actual facts and the understanding that was already established. So,
but I think he was in part reacting to the fact that the understanding that had already been established was not having any kind of effect. He was grappling with why is it that it doesn't have any effect, and so the theory, rather than blame the theory for the fact, I think that theory was already a response to the fact.
I just suspect that if he had started from the position of someone like, if he had started by evaluating Mark Lane and Jim Garrison and I forget the woman's name, but the woman who created the index for the Warren Commission report, and also, multiple others. And if he had started from the perspective of kind of flat-footed realist and read the Warren Commission report and seen what all of its faults were, that his theorizing would have shifted to a more political and less epistemic framework. That because he would have been able to see with some clarity what the reality was regarding. It was not actually a rabbit hole. It was not difficult for theorists or the public to understand if they paid attention to it, but rather the problem was a political one.
You think it's really just, if people like Jameson had said that there is a clear
well, no, I don't think it's simply
what happened,
yeah,
that would have changed the politics of it?
Well, I don't. So the counter to that would be to say, if Jameson had approached it that way, his future would have been the same kind of future as people like Mark Lane and others like them. In other words, that he could not have achieved the level of notoriety, success, and influence on the left if he had started from that position of being closer to the truth. So that, but then that raises the problem up a level. At least, now we have to ask ourselves, how is the left itself being policed and dominated? And
so if the state is intervening in a way that obscures and confuses people, then that would have to be theoretically accounted for, rather than just assert that we have the facts. We would have to take into account that there's going to be this state intervention that will create continuous confusion. Whether we think the confusion arises from some sort of organic social process, or we think the confusion is created by the state, it's still a fact that you would have to deal with.
True. Someone asked, who's Mark Lane? And I want to point out his last name is spelled Lane, not Lain like mine. Not a relative of mine as far as I can tell. He was the attorney who, on the day of the assassination, tried to become Oswald's legal representative. He was turned away by the police. Before that could be settled, Oswald was shot and killed the very next day. He ended up representing Oswald's mother, trying to defend Oswald's name. He wrote a book called Rush to Judgment and created a film that came out in 1967 called Rush to Judgment, where it was a documentary where he interviewed on camera about a dozen witnesses who saw the people on the grassy knoll, and in a variety of ways. By 1967, with that film, created reasonable doubt, at the very least, around Oswald. So that's who Mark Lane was. And he continued to work on that as part of what he did until his death, and published multiple books along that line. That just to answer the question.
A thought along the lines of what we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what has gone on is that the state has created confusion in society, and then the confused society is replicated in various ways in the state, such that the state itself over time becomes more confused internally in various ways. And so then the state, in trying to create or perpetuate confusion, does this in an increasingly confused way.
Well, I mean, if you watch the hearings that just happened, it was not very confusing. What was clear was that the Democrats were trying to muddy the waters, and the Republicans wanted the story to come forward, which is worthy of consideration as to why that would be the case right now. I mean, it's not that difficult to understand why, but and that could certainly be reversed in another 2 to 3 years as to who wants this story to come forward and who wants it to be suppressed. But the actual facts weren't difficult to glean from the hearing, and yet the hearing wasn't taken up by the left or the mainstream liberal media either as something to be worthy of consideration. So I would just say that it's not just the state creates confusion, but it is the faction of the state, the part of the state that considers itself to be progressive and on the side of the workers, that in this moment, in any case, and probably for longer than that, has helped to create confusion and suppress history. And certainly,
you have all these quangos, you have all these corporate organizations that have some sort of nebulous relation to state actors that also participate in this game, all of which claim to be private organizations.
Right, right. Yeah, that is true. Listen, we're one hour and 10 minutes in. I did get to talk about Kennedy, which makes me happy, weirdly. And we should say goodbye to everyone for now and go over to the someone asked how much of Doug's brain is occupied by JFK facts. I would say 20%. The rest is about girls basically. So anyway, I'll talk to everyone over on the at the Patreon on the Zoom call after party. We can talk about this more. And thank you very much for watching today. We'll see you next week, and maybe we'll talk more about the tariffs and see what's developed in the meantime.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people live